So friends, good morning and very warm welcome to this session. As we just finished our breakfast meeting upstairs, all the FIDC and NEST members and our representatives from different states would be coming and joining us. I would request Dr. Nagesh Kumar, who has to lead this session, to join us here on the dais, along with all the speakers who are already here. I think without further delay, we should start this session, though we are already delayed by 10 minutes. And just for chair, I see a slip which is very handy, a 5 minutes margin or end. So I think today also we would be having more stimulating discussions as we progress, and at the end of the day would have substantive conclusions and way forward. Dr. Nagesh Kumar is well known to everybody. He was my predecessor here at RIS as Director General, but for last several years is with the other speaker on the panel, what Yuri represents, the United Nations, and he's heading the social sector division in Bangkok. So Dr. Nagesh, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachin. Good morning, very distinguished members of this very important conference on South-South cooperation. As we heard yesterday, South-South cooperation is the philosophy which has been around for many years, but is now gaining a lot of momentum. And especially this session, we're going to focus on how South-South cooperation can play a very critical role in getting the sustainable development goals achieved by developing countries. And we all know that sustainable development goals is a very ambitious set of agenda, very ambitious set of transformative universal agenda before all of us. And this is a real chance and opportunity for developing countries to come out of poverty and hunger and provide a life of dignity to every one of their citizens, leaving no one behind, within a generation, just 15 years. And of course, we are already in 2018. But my belief is that with a commitment of the leaderships, which is demonstrated already in many forms, it is possible to achieve, no matter they are very ambitious. And these goals will also require a lot of resources, a lot of financial resources. In ESCAP, a couple of years ago, we made a calculation of what it might entail. And so even some of the social goals, poverty, hunger, the job security, nutrition, the health and education, etc., that in many countries would require up to 20% of GDP to be deployed, over the period up to 2030. So a lot of resources will be required, and Addis Ababa Action Agenda, of course, we talked a lot about domestic resource mobilization to be the primary resource. But we have to face the reality that savings rates in many developing countries, especially least developed countries, are very low. And so they need to be supplemented. The domestic resources need to be supplemented from outside or external development finance. And that we know, we have talked for 40 years, the 0.7% target for ODA, which continues to remain elusive. ODA in real terms and nominal terms is declining actually for the past few years. And the excuse given is that there is a crisis of migration, refugees crisis, and they are being sort of given attention out of the resources which were meant for ODA. But the interesting part is that South-South cooperation is, supplementing or complementing the ODA, which is not increasing. And the figures, if you look at the figures of South-South cooperation and resource flows, has been rising very impressively. I was struck in 2008 when I was still at RIS. I did a paper on South-South cooperation, and we tried to get a figure, one figure of South-South cooperation's magnitude. It was about $10 billion. And recently, I found that it has grown to $25 billion, and Jorge might have more updates on that, and he is, of course, best equipped to say what exactly is the quantum of South-South cooperation. But even those imperfect numbers that I found show that between 2009, 10, and 2018, there is a jump of 2.5 times, so which is very encouraging. But the potential is of course, much larger. The other possibility for closing the resource gap could be the multilateral development banks bridge that gap for least developed countries and developing countries that need resources. But the existing multilateral development banks, we all know, are stuck in a very difficult situation because of the governance structures. The key players or key stakeholders or shareholders of these banks are not in a position to sort of raise their resources, and they won't let others to bring in capital, such as the Asian countries, which have substantial foreign exchange reserves and are in a position to augment the resources of multilateral development banks. So developing countries built their own institutions. So you have seen in the past few years emergence of the new catalyzing much larger resources for investment in developing countries. So this is a very important development we should recognize. But the potential is much larger. I mean, I think South-South cooperation in finance for SDGs could be, I think, way beyond the creation of the new multilateral development banks and the development partnership of resource transfers. But I think South-South cooperation has a much bigger role to play in financing for SDGs. And this could include, for instance, the sharing of development experiences in mobilizing finance, mobilizing domestic resources, the innovative taxes, for instance, the way many countries have found innovative mechanisms for supporting and building, SDGs. India, for instance, is funding its primary education program, universal literacy program, through a cess imposed on income tax. This is very well known to this audience. But Bhutan and Maldives, for instance, are raising resources for green transformation through green taxes on tourism and all that. So there are many innovative new experiments going on. There is also huge potential of sharing development experiences in financial inclusion, in micro pensions, because universal social protection is also one of the SDGs. And so there are many interesting experiences from across the developing countries in micro pension, micro insurance, and then impact investments, the social impact bonds, fintech, using fintech and mobile banking. So getting access to the poorest of the poor to the modern financial services. And many other such innovations, including mobilizing private investments for SDGs, as India has done through these CSR regulation, the corporate social responsibility new rule, which requires companies to set aside 2% of their profits for corporate social responsibility, which has mobilized about $8 billion of additional resources for SDGs every year. So those are the kind of new experiments and innovations that we should learn from each other and share between us. Finally, one innovative mechanism for raising resources, which was discussed some time back in G20, but was put on the back burner because some countries are not ready for that, which is financial transaction tax. And I had done some back of the envelope kind of calculations. At the very conservative, rates of that tax, it could provide to you every year a running income of $700 billion. Imagine 5 times as much as ODA, entire ODA becoming available through a tax, which will also help in moderating the extreme volatility of short-term capital flows. So I think there are many, many areas of cooperation between developing countries to get new resources, additional resources for financing and supporting the achievement of sustainable development goals. And this is the focus of this panel, and I won't take any more of your time, but turn to our very eminent panel that Sachin has put together for this discussion. And let me just turn to this. Among the panelists, we have on my right Mr. Yuri Afanasiev, who is the resident coordinator of United Nations country team. So all different agencies that have operations in India work in coordination with Yuri. And Yuri has been, I have seen him in action for last few years because I used to head the ESCAP South and Southwest Asia office, which is located in Delhi. And so I had the privilege of working with Yuri very closely during those times, and I'm looking forward to be part of the country team again, as I decided to move back to run that office again. So I'll begin with Yuri to take us through his thoughts on this subject, and then I'll introduce the other panelists as we go along. And because time is short, and we started a bit late, maybe 6-7 minutes for an intervention. So Yuri, you have the floor.
Distinguished members on the dais, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me a chance to speak to you on this landmark issue of how to finance the SDGs and what is the role of South-South cooperation. I understand that today you were made to start at 8:30 by Sachin, so a note verbal is coming to your office from me in protest, because I think that equals cruel and unusual punishment. But the good thing is that you have woken up by now by 9:30 for our session, so you can't really talk about money at 8:30 in the morning. It's really not good. Look, I think Nagesh, thank you for setting the scene and mentioning some important trends and numbers. I think there are a lot of experts in the room, and certainly my friend Jorge is here, who leads the Office of South-South Cooperation, and he has probably even more updated data and trends. So what I thought I would do in this short talk with you today in the morning is look a little bit beyond the status quo. And I want to mentally bring you back to the beginning of the discussion yesterday at the opening, and what Professor Acharya took us to in terms of looking at really the megatrends for the next 10-15 years, which is the term of the Agenda 2030, and how the world will look like, even though predictions are an ungrateful part of analysis, but nevertheless. When we joined, whether our academic institutions or the development industry, in our kind of generation, the world was simple, life was simple. There was a clear breakdown that there was ODA, and there was concessional lending for countries who qualified, then there was FDI, And then in the later part of that, we also got to know that CSR and corporate philanthropy and private philanthropy started becoming an important issue in development finance. Then I think we can bring us mentally to the Addis Ababa discussions right before the SDGs were adopted and signed and before the Paris Agreement, which was a meeting dedicated to the means of implementation. And while I'm simplifying the discussions held there, it was largely about two big important means of implementation, and one was money, and the other one was technology and technology transfer. Now, if you remember how that discussion went, it was all about how to mobilize domestic finance for the SDGs, and India, along with some other allied countries, led a valiant fight to put on the table the discussion of taxation. And essentially corporate transfers, white, gray, and black, which take away resources from developing countries, which otherwise, if those taxes were paid locally where the profits were made, would go into the state treasury in the form of taxes and be reinvested into all kinds of health and education and other priorities that the countries have. That discussion India did not win. But hopefully it is just a battle that was lost and not a war, because frankly, from where I sit, from our perspective, unless that discussion actually comes to some sensible culminating conclusion, the whole story about the Agenda 2030 is financially unsolvable. Which brings us to where we are today, and back to what Professor Acharya was saying about a multiplex world. I actually like the comparison. I'm going to borrow it from him with a written authorization, if he doesn't mind, because indeed we are witnessing today very interesting trends that 10, 15 years ago were actually even impossible to think of. Some Nagesh has touched upon, where without blinking an eye, northern countries are taking ODA and using it on their own territory to deal with the migration crisis. And when they originally mentioned it, to me in one of the conversations we had in New York, I actually didn't realize what the conversation was about, so I did a double take and asked twice. And they said, yeah, we're using, I will not mention the country, our ODA that we used to give to the UN and to our partners in the developing world, and we're using it to deal with migrants on the territory of that country. And I said, but that's not ODA, that's your internal problem. No, we're reclassifying it. It's a big problem, we're dealing with it. Second thing that was unthinkable was there was this large commitment that the developing world, India and many others, welcomed very much, which was the promise of 200 billion into climate finance, which I think we know today, after developments in the last 24 months, is largely a wishful thinking promise. That money is not going to become available for the moment. And so that whole big discussion about how developing countries will finance the conversion of their economies to clean tech, clean energy, including transfer of technology, which is being also not facilitated at the moment, is under question. So I also want to bring us back to the statement, which I thought was very, very well calibrated yesterday morning by Secretary Tirumurti, who restated India's position about this whole issue. So whatever I'm going to say in the next couple of minutes, it has to be taken with that caveat. Of course, certainly most of us in the UN, we believe that India's position, which represents, I think, a large portion of the developing world and of the South, is very, very correct in the sense that we need to insist and continue insisting on the promises that were made and the obligations that they are there. And this includes the already mentioned by Nagesh 0.7% in ODA. We need to continue insisting on technology transfer and 200 billion into climate finance. We need to insist on the principle of differentiated responsibility. However, and here's where I end the caveat, having said that, which is laudable and I think has to continue, and India should, together with other countries, create a lobby and a coalition that is coherent and speaks with one voice and does not get fragmented and diluted in terms of its position. we can't wait for the next 5 to 10 years for these promises to come through as the developing world. There are immediate problems that we need to solve. There are immediate investments that we need to make. There are issues, again, with clean energy, climate finance, and development finance, and elimination of poverty, and the whole Agenda 2030 that we need to start financing from other resources. ODA, as was just said, has risen to a peak, but then has declined in the last few years. It will never be what it was 50 years ago. It will, at best, be a catalyst to help countries experiment with solutions. But otherwise, I think we're on the verge of a different period in human history, where a lot of the developments recently made will allow developing countries to move ahead without waiting for the traditional solutions and the traditional finance, while still insisting on mandatory compliance. We are seeing that the system of rules that has governed our existence for the last 70 years is breaking down. Even the WTO mechanisms are starting to break down, even though it was the West that actually insisted on these conditions and was behind the origination of the WTO mechanisms. The Doha round on especially the areas dedicated to agriculture has been long forgotten, leaving development countries on the brink. And yes, new banks and new financial instruments and mechanisms have appeared as a solution to a lack of alternatives, because the reform of the existing institutions has not gone ahead smoothly. Now, I predict that the next big revolution facilitated by technology will actually be in banking and finance. The combination of blockchain and quantum computing will revolutionize how money moves around the world and how people choose to invest it, how people choose to transfer it, and how countries choose to invest it. I think we're about 5 to 7 years away from that revolution, but I think that is the next big Rubicon that will affect how development happens, and I predict that for us in the development business, it will be an incredibly important development. Now, looking forward, clearly there will be still countries that require development finance in its traditional sense, and I'm speaking of the LDCs, I'm speaking about maybe small island development states who don't have the capability or can contribute or receive a lot from the South-South cooperation or triangular cooperation mechanisms, which will still require significant transfers of ODA, and they will rely, at least in the foreseeable period, on that top-up. But having said that, I think the second big development and a revolution is what I describe as intelligent development. And intelligent development is a situation where, you know, in years past and throughout my work in the UN, governments and the UN looked at the problem, scoped the problem, identified it, measured it, and then allocated resources to solve that complete problem. Today, I think, with big data and analytics that is increasingly coming to the fore, we are increasingly able to laser point development solutions to a problem. I'll give you an example from India. We know that in India, 152 districts have significant prevalence of malnutrition. But we also know that if we solve that problem in 52 districts, the problem largely will be solved in the country. And I think the concept of critical mass and intelligent development by laser pointing interventions will save governments significant public resources which can be productively spent elsewhere, while introducing what is increasingly becoming a new concept of financing, which is blended finance. Unfortunately, over the past 50 years, we've been looking in silos at how we finance development interventions. There was the government allocations that went to health and education. Then, ODA came in with the development community and the UN system and financed bits and pieces of there. Then countries that qualified would go to the Bretton Woods institutions and borrow and invest additionally into there. But it was all kind of separate initiatives, separate projects, and there was no continuity between those efforts. Increasingly, what we're saying, certainly in the UN, and I know many of you in the in the development industry, is that it is time to start looking at the continuum of resources. We can use ODA or government finance to public finance to experiment with a solution and go to these 5 out of 52 districts in my example on malnutrition and test approaches of what are the best ways to make it work. But then it has to be other resources that scale that up. And certainly when one serves in India, the concept of scaling up becomes an obsessive target because nothing really prepares you for the scale of India. But, you know, a similar approach has to happen in other developing countries which are much smaller in terms of population, territory, economy than India, because if you don't scale it up, you don't impact the problem at the output end. I think also, looking into the future, we are looking at some sort of a tax compact globally. And we are witnessing a situation today that because of economic competition, it's a race to the bottom, where countries need to demonstrate their competitiveness by creating tax regimes, both for domestic investors and for foreign investors, that are competitively better than the neighboring country. Now, it is unfortunate that as a result of that, even in the West, we are seeing incredible rises in inequality, which, if not arrested in good time, will lead to unfortunate and possibly violent developments in our societies. So I think we are looking at a number of revolutionary trends and agreements and compacts that were well started by the Global Compact on the SDGs, on the Paris Climate Agreement, which will then have these 2 or 3 additional global agreements that will create a new framework for both economic cooperation, trade, development, and importantly, what the word that India very much uses and likes, and I agree with it, to introduce a concept of solidarity among developing countries, where South-South cooperation is clearly one of the networks and the mechanisms to do that. Last but not least, serving in India, I have to say a word on the importance of this country, I think, for the leadership in the South. India is in a unique position. I mean, my Indian friends in the room know that I'm quite bullish on both India's social and economic development in the coming decade or two. I think it will continue to grow. I think it will be the 3rd or the 2nd largest economy by the time we hit mid-century. I think the unique combination of conditions in India and the challenge and the size of the development objectives that it has will also motivate, and it is already motivating India, to invent solutions that are much cheaper, much quicker, much better than the traditional solutions to our development challenges that we had in past decades. And I think the innovations and the solutions that are invented here, and we can already refer ourselves to the biggest deployment of solar and renewable and wind energy in the world today. We can refer to, LED lighting. We can refer to digital technologies in terms of social benefits and the famous, what we call here in India, GEM Trinity, which has now been offered, I think, to countries in Africa to replicate on a voluntary basis. Those examples of innovative, low-cost, high-impact solutions that are invented here or elsewhere. I'm not saying they will only be invented in India, but I think India will have a disproportionate weight in this whole dimension. How we then analyze, transport, and domesticate these solutions to our different needs across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and how we implement them is, I think, a challenge to us all, and this is where forums like this and South-South cooperation in principle as a new emerging network of cooperation among developing countries will be key. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuri. I did not expect anything less from you than such an insightful set of remarks, and that's why I didn't stop you. It's all right. It was time very well spent, as everyone agrees. I think Yuri highlighted the importance of cooperation for exploiting the fruits of new innovations. As he said, low-cost, high-impact innovations in finance and in delivery of public services. That will take us through to the 2030 deadline with the achievements of SDGs. So without any further ado, let me turn to our next speaker, who is Ms. Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha is from Institute for Global Dialogue in South Africa. You have the floor. Again, 6-7 minutes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and keep the 6 to 7 minutes. Greetings, and again, thank you to the organizers for always inviting me to this very illustrious and thought-provoking discussions on development cooperation. I think with my 5 minutes now, I'll try and get to the points that I want to make and not go back to what has been a very interesting characterization of development finance and South-South cooperation that the previous speaker made. I think one of the challenges I found in yesterday's conversation and discussions, as well as in the parallel sessions, was trying to find that reconciliation between the quantitative and the qualitative impacts that South-South cooperation can bring in the context of a changing landscape around development cooperation. And there's two things that struck me. One is we're dealing not with intangible issues, but we're dealing with human lives and livelihoods. And how do we actually impact on people's lives so that we leave nobody behind? And that seems to be the point of departure for the discussion in defining whether we can create a theoretical perspective on South-South cooperation, as well as try and find the link between the evidence-based and the theory. The second thing is, what are the tools we use or the resources we use? And so development finance and its evolution from the time in which it has been moved from ODA to blended finance. How do we deal with that? And how does that make a meaningful contribution to this motto of the SDGs, is leave no one behind? And so this brings me to 3 points I want to make in this regard. The first is, as research actors, think tanks that are not in the policy space but trying to influence the policy space, the question is, how do we use evidence-based studies to inform theory? Because I think very often as think tanks, we try to take the theory and try and locate it within the evidence. But I think what the SDGs do for us now, given the short time frame, less than 12 years to implement, is the fact that it enables us to find an actionable framework of what is it that we're trying to do that brings not just states into the framework, but all actors from a broad realm of areas to think about what is it that we're trying to do in changing people's livelihoods. And this is where I think the role of evidence-based studies is important for us as researchers to think about how do we link it to policy implementation and policy research, which is the first point I want to make. The second point is that I think by utilizing the SDGs as an actionable framework, we can see the diversity of South-South cooperation. And in that is where we're trying to, I think, not lose the vibrancy of what South-South cooperation brings, but at the same time, don't let South-South cooperation become a status quo approach. So we're trying to link up with the technology advances. I think what the chair said in the end was a low-cost, high-impact kind of actionable framework. Now, with that point that I made around evidence-based research and informing theory, one of the things that struck me was that leave nobody behind means that after 2030, we should actually have a world that's veritably less in terms of inequalities, that people should be feeling included into the financial system, that they should be able to enjoy blended finance, access their savings, not feel like they've been overtaxed and overburdened, not seeing a widening salary gap. And this brings me to a very interesting book that I'm currently reading for my course, and that is The Precariat in Every Society. That class of people that are living in a marginalized setting. They don't have access. They constantly, their living standard is constantly in a precarious status quo. And they are the excluded that we need to include into this whole SDG framework. And so the question in my mind is, what happens after 2030 when there are still people that are left behind? And how do we then go forward in terms of the development finance that we're talking about whether we have an inclusion in terms of a tax base, or whether we actually taxing people in order to cover costs at a higher level. And I can think of my country, South Africa, as an example of a very small tax base, but an overburdened policy space where the salaries are exorbitant. And I suspect that we may see similar trends in other countries where the political and economic crisis is actually linked to the way people are feeling marginalized from the system, whether they have access to resources. And then this means, what does the implications or impact have for global governance? The very institutions we are trying to reform, the very institutions we're trying to create inclusion for, are we not going to be just repeating the same issues, and then we continue to have an ongoing precariat class that remains on the verges of the global economy, of the national economy, of the domestic resources, and so forth? And as I was thinking about this, it made me think about the fact that after 2030, are we going to see another Millennium Development Goal or a 21st Century Sustainable Development Framework? Because the one thing we haven't necessarily discussed is populations are growing in particular parts of the world. And there are constantly burdens on national economies, national development programs. And so in Africa, with a positive population growth, there's constantly a need to try and include people into the urbanization of services. And as that happens, when people start to move from rural to urban, there's constant pressure on the system. So at what point does the system continue to contain itself, or does it begin to implode? And I think we've seen this with the questions around development finance, institutional reform, and so forth. And I just want to end on the point that I thought was very important that was made yesterday in terms of the multiplex world and where this multiplex world is going. And I think the multiplex world is interesting because there are those of us that can get into the multiplex center, but there are those of us who can't afford the ticket into the multiplex center. And if we cannot afford the ticket into the multiplex center, then the multiplex center becomes an institution of its own for a particular group of people who can access it. So I think one of the things that I want to end on is not to become so morbid, but to end on a positive note, and to say that one of the areas that South Africa has been pushing around development finance, particularly in infrastructure development and trying to ensure that it aligns to some of the global trends around development finance, is trying to use pension funds as part of that motion or that intervention for financing for development. There are different contradictions around this. There are contradictions of what does this mean on returns of investment and so forth. But I think it does represent some of the innovation that is coming out of Africa through South Africa's role, as well as in terms of the question of the illicit transaction flows that leave Africa every year in terms of resources, which South Africa has been key in the developing working group on the G20 as well, to use that as a mechanism of finding a viable, if not a much more policy-orientated mechanism of financing for development in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanusha, for all your very insightful remarks on financial inclusion, and particularly I like the last remark that you made about mobilizing the pension funds for sustainable development and infrastructure financing. And I think this is one area where South can learn a lot from South and develop new ways of harnessing the potential of pension funds. With that, let me turn to our next speaker, Professor Wu Jin from College of Humanities and Development Studies, Beijing. You have, again, 6-7 minutes, if you can. Thank you.
Morning, thank you, Chair, and also thank you, Professor Sachin and our colleagues from RES to inviting me for this conference. I think it's the right time to talk about the role of South-South cooperation. I think especially as the world economy is threatened by new type of trade protectionism and also political populism. Before I share with my comments for the documents and all these topics, I would like to share some findings from the field, what we did, the Chinese team in the southern country like Tanzania and other countries. The morning, the breakfast roundtable meeting, I share a little bit, use 2 minutes to share our work in the South-South Cooperation M&E framework report. That report was that work was with the support of UNDP Beijing office. Our CAU team has developed a South-South framework, and with the Chinese perspective, and also applied this framework in the case studies of China-Tanzania cooperation. And this work, I think, have been contributed by our next colleague like Andrew and Nissan last year. And the framework strictly follows the concept and the principles of South-South cooperation given by the UN. It covers the South-South trade and the South-South flaws of FDI movements towards regional integration and technology transfers, and sharing the situation and solutions and experts and other forms of exchanges. And it is also based on the principle emphasize demand-driven approaches and respect for national ownership and independency. Of course, equality, non-conditionality, and non-interference in domestic affairs and mutual benefit. And the framework serves two special purposes. One is to provide with the suited information in the partner country of Chinese South-South projects, so that the Chinese public will know about. Actually, I think I'm from China, especially Beijing. We are talking about in a lot of conference of South-South cooperation. But to be frank, within the Chinese society, few people understand South-South cooperation and what kind of Chinese project in the overseas and southern countries. So that the Chinese public will know what the Chinese is doing in other developing countries. And also the partner country will be also informed about the logic of the project implementation from Chinese perspective. By doing so, the mutual understanding will be, emphasized. The second is to analyze the outcome, output, and also impact of Chinese projects from partner countries' perspective, so that the policy makers and the project implementation from China will learn the relevant lessons and also act upon with improved actions in the future. And the framework proposed in this research contains 5 dimensions, that is political, economy, social, environment, and technical, following the 9 guiding principles of South-South cooperation and the 15 indicators. So far, we have finished the case studies on the section of infrastructure, agriculture, and health. And the biggest challenge when we are doing this work, when we're gathering the data from the field, is deficiency, the data deficiency. I think making South-South cooperation evaluation more difficult. So we used a qualitative method, data, rather than the quantitative to get different perspective on the project. So based on our research experience, we do think the diversity and the flexibility for South-South cooperation should be tolerated. And the first step to design South-South cooperation M&E framework should be adopted the availability and validate of existing system, data system. To be, for example, measurable, understandable, acceptable by as many as more stakeholders, and also pertinent by reflecting the nature of South-South cooperation. This should be the top concern when we design the South-South M&E framework and do the data gathering in the field. And lastly, I will share some points as my comments. I was invited to be. So Theoretically speaking, I think I have to say that I agree with all the most of the statements. For example, the principle of South-South cooperation should be unnegotiable. South-South cooperation should not replace the North-South cooperation, but a complement to it. South-South cooperation is volunteer and a demand-driven process, etc. However, very little effort has been given on how to implement and evaluate the South-South projects. And compared with the North-South cooperation, South-South cooperation has many advantages in contributing to 2030 agenda of sustainable development. It is not only brings more development resources for developing countries, which can be used to provide better public goods and improve the people's living standard. Of course, it's also provides leverage for least developing countries, especially those developing on foreign aid, to enhance their negotiating power when accepting aid from traditional donors, so that the recipient countries can have the ownership in mobilizing all available resources in line with their national strategy and plans. Moreover, the technology and the development experience will also flow among southern countries through South-South cooperation to enhance the technical and the governance capacity of partner countries. But anyway, it is widely acknowledged that South cooperation has become very important element of the global cooperation architecture for sustainable development. However, I would say more efforts are still needed to generate knowledge on South-South, both theoretically and empirically. Thank you. Thank you for your.
Thank you, Professor Wu Jin, for sharing the insights you gathered from your fieldwork and dealing with case studies of South-South cooperation, which is very interesting, actually. I think we need to go to the field to see how actual projects are shaping up and what can be learned for future. So with that, let me now turn to our next speaker, who is Dr. Adriano Timossi of the South Center. And South Center, as you know, is a very important institution. Yesterday we had Carlos Correa, the new director of the South Center, with us. And Adriano has been a very important staff and official of the South Center for many years. But he also had a stay with RIS long time ago, in the beginning of his career, and so we claim some credit of his good work on South-South cooperation. So Adriano, you have the floor. Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I wish to thank RIS and our good friends Sachin, and my mentor, Nagesh Kumar, because if I'm here, it's because of Nagesh. First time that I came for RIS, and 10 years ago. So it is indeed a great pleasure, and to be among friends, to be discussing issues that it's very dear to our daily lives. South-South cooperation is the DNA of the RIS and the South Center. Both organizations, they were created because developing countries, our leaders, they had the vision that we needed institutions that could help us to walk on our own foot, to have a collective self-reliance, and to be able to do better for our people. When you talk about South-South cooperation, as many colleagues here have said, we're not talking about competition or North-South or which one is the best, but what we are bringing. Because we talk about development, what do we bring to our people? The main goal of development is to bring a better life, to reduce poverty, to reduce hunger, to bring conditions that people can have a minimum dignified life. I've been working a few trainings with the UN System Staff College and the UN Office on South-South Cooperation with Dr. Shedek. And these trainings are more or less 1.5 hours that I have to speak, so I bring a lot of practical examples to the students. And I always show some photos from Switzerland in the countryside and the countryside in other developing countries. So you can see that the difference is massive, but we don't want to become a Switzerland, but we just want to have a minimum life that we can give to our people. So my presentation will be very brief because most has been said. I'm trying to show a little bit of what the South Center has been doing in cooperation with your governments from developing countries that are member states of my organization, but also with institutions and academics like you. So all your comments, your criticism, or your inputs are very much welcome. Very brief because I don't have much time. So the South Center was created under leadership of Julius Nyerere, and this commission that's called South Commission worked for 3 years. The idea was that we needed to reflect on our own views, our own challenges in the South. After 3 years, this commission suggested to create a Secretariat of the South. So this Secretariat of the South started as a follow-up office, which is called South Center. And for 5 years, we've been trying to figure out where we would go, because also member states, they were also quite in difficult position to really create a kind of OECD of the South. So we didn't become an OECD of the South, we just become a small office of 25 people in Geneva. And then why in Geneva? You talk about the South, so you go to Geneva. So because Geneva is the place where development issues is being negotiated. Geneva is the place of the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, UNCTAD, and many other organizations. So the idea was to be there and to provide support for diplomats, because my work is in multilateral diplomacy. The work of the South Center, most of it, is to support South-South cooperation in multilateral diplomacy. So we support the G77, the non-aligned movement, and member states of all developing countries, member states of G77, in some policies and the views that we believe are the ones that we should go. Particularly on the reform of the international system, because we believe that to implement the Agenda 2030, there is a need for important reforms on the international trade, on the international system. One of them was just said by Mrs. Yuri, is the issue of WTO. An ambassador from Argentina is here who was greatly involved on the negotiations of Uruguay. So we are still waiting on the issues of agriculture. We are still waiting. The Doha development round, we are still waiting it to be implemented. But now, even worse, this will be dropped. So we may have a new round, new topics, and the long-standing topic of agriculture, that's basically one of the most important for developing countries. Maybe 80% of the poor in our countries are living in agriculture and rely on agriculture. So if you don't have an agreement on this, if you don't have the long-awaited and promised reduction and access to market, reduction of subsidies. We had just a few weeks ago that the US announced that they increased $15 billion the subsidies for the cotton farmers in the US. So what about the cotton farmers in Africa that are striking to be competitive with support of South cooperation, because you can see that one of the main work also being a Brazilian, the cotton 4 countries, we are also working to transfer technology in African countries. But what about the South-South cooperation helps to transfer technology, but then when the farmers in Mali or other Western African countries, they go to the market, they cannot compete because the cotton from the US is more competitive thanks to subsidies. So this is one of the biggest challenges that we have. Okay, so what we do? We support on WTO issues, mainly on agriculture. We are supporting on the World Health Organization. We are supporting in UNCTAD. I have a very long presentation, but I have to jump on it. So let me start just here on the one of the main issues that we have been doing. So what we are doing that is really very recent is the South-South cooperation tax issues. So we have created a forum for development experts, officers from government officers from developing countries. We are getting all together and we are trying to work in a way that we can discuss how we see the issue, the landscape of tax policies. So this is one of the most important initiatives that we have started. As you know, our chairman of our board, Estabo Mebek, is very much into it from the issue of illicit funds. So we are trying to gather through South-South cooperation, multilateral issues. We are trying to gather developing countries and to make sure that we can overcome this biggest challenge, because as you know, like in Africa, $50 to $80 billion has been lost in illicit financial flows. So if we don't have a success on those international negotiations on these issues, because as you know, the US has been also very reluctant to work on these issues on the UN. Another important issue is that our work is on investment. We created also a forum for developing country officials on investment issues, because as you know, many countries, they have signed bilateral investment treaties. Those bilateral investment treaties, they have indeed impacted in developing countries. One example now, just recently, Uruguay, they changed the policy on the cigarettes. So the idea is that they wanted to, the pack of cigarettes, they wanted to just not to use the name of the company. So this company, they sued the government of Uruguay, because the government of Uruguay, they said, for public health reasons, I have the right to implement a policy that can contribute to reduce the use of cigarettes. So the company entered against Uruguay, and they asked $22 million for the government of Uruguay, because the policy that the government of Uruguay was implementing was causing potential losses for the company. So are you talking about public health and life, or talk about private interests? So this is what we have been doing in the South Center. We're trying to boost South-South cooperation in a way that can change those rules. So we are mobilizing a big gathering of developing countries on this issue. Another issue is that the Human Rights Council, initiative of Ecuador, and particularly Ambassador Espinosa, who was here yesterday, now the President of the General Assembly, she has started in Geneva very important work that is a resolution to create a legally binding instrument on TNCs and the human rights. So the main idea is that multinational corporations work in other countries, they should be able to follow their human rights obligations, because as you know, even the least transfer of funds from these companies to another tax haven paradise is money that we could be using to promote development to our people. So, as I said, we work on another issue very important with India, the right to development. Developed countries, they don't want even to listen to the right to development. Just recently, the US has asked on the high-level political forum declaration to take out, to cut the mention to the right to development. Because for the US, right to development is a collective right, but it doesn't have any meaning in international law. So these types of things we are trying to do in the South Center, to support developing countries, to continue to be together, to work together to create conditions to implement the agenda. The existence of the G77, I think, is the best example of the South-South cooperation. Just to finish, and the climate change, another important issue, as has been said for several of your colleagues and the Secretary for Economic Affairs. What to talk about the international obligations that those countries they have, international development obligations, the 0.7%, the climate change, the fund. We see that, as has been just said, the Sweden, other countries in Europe, they are now using ODA money for refugees and for migrants. So what about their commitments? Because then you can say, yeah, but don't come with this rhetoric of south, north, south divide. But most of these countries, they really developed thanks to protectionism, and that to some large extent they developed because of the colonization. So it's easy to me. I become rich, but don't follow my way now. You have to follow your way. And the North-South, no more money, so South-South can replace North-South. So those are issues that we have to change. The TRIPS agreement on WTO, no, that provides flexibilities for developing countries to access to medicines. This is a fight that developing countries had in the WTO. So all those issues that I could have many others, but I know that the time is limited, but I can leave it to you. So I'm very grateful to be here to listen to you, because our views on South-South cooperation towards BAPA, you all know, is the G77 views. We are working together, so the same views that Secretary of Economic Relations has said. So I look forward to hear from you, your inputs, and to work with you in the future to make to implement the agenda. Otherwise, we'll come back. Just said now, we'll come back here in 30 years' time, 20 years' time, with a new agenda. Maybe you'll be in the same level of the agenda of Africa Agenda 2063. But we need really to move and to make change in the international system that can allow our people. And of course, we also have to do change, because if we create elite in the South that can do the same that the North did, will be all the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriano, for briefing us the work of South Center, especially in the area of finance, the work on tax cooperation among developing countries, work on illicit financing. All of these can be very important in generating and preserving resources that flow out of developing countries. So thank you for introducing us. I'm sorry to rush you, but the time is short for all of us. Yeah, so let me now turn to our next speaker, Ms. Roxana Mazzola from Center for Studies and Policy Development in Argentina. If you can try to sum up your presentation in 5-7.
First of all, let me thank you for the invitation. I am pleased to be here once again. And I would like to emphasize 3 points, 4 questions and 5 proposals about South-South cooperation and financial on SDG, with a special attention in the social situation in Latin American countries. First, let me have one consideration about SDG and the heating debate of inequality and the reasons of inequality. The SDG has a high level of formality. For instance, who cannot agree that we have to have zero hunger, non-poverty, and decent work? The SDGs express good intention and everyone agrees with them, but the heating debate is the debate related to inequalities. It is the inequality among countries rather than in countries that continue to explain most of the world's inequality. Therefore, changes are necessary in a global scale in which the increase of international commerce in Latin America, or only with more development finance, will not be enough to reduce inequalities. For instance, it's necessary to emphasize to address the new regulation in international financial flow. Capital mobility must be balanced through workforce mobility. This year, I had the opportunity to participate in one G20 conference in Argentina. And I talked about what was the impact on trade on the reduction of inequality in Latin America. And my conclusion was, it's impossible to reduce the inequality only with trade, or with superfluous modification of income in Latin America. Our politicians discuss all the time how to reduce poverty, but we know poverty does not mean inequality. Modifying inequalities implies long-term processes and not merely refer to gender gap, property, distribution of land, and concentration of political powers and influences. Secondly, Latin America presents a vast inequality with conditions all manners of distribution of resources. In a world where capital reproduction demands specific roles in the international labor divisions, our country had not succeeded in designing institutional framework that can mitigate this global disparity, but which rather make it explicit. And as you know, this is political. Economic decisions are not taken out of the blue, but they do depend on political ideology. Latin America is the second most unequal region of the world, only behind Sub-Saharan Africa, and this inequality presents some specific feature. It principally affects children. There are a large territorial disparities. For instance, in Brazil and Argentina, the richest lands are 8 times as rich as the poorest lands, whereas in Italy, France, and Spain, the gap is reduced to just twice. The chances are very high that disparity will persist in the future unless we are global changes as well as changes in the productive and social heterogeneity of the region. Thirdly, all things considered, let us then admit that the South-South cooperation have to promote some debate and question related development finals on SDG. One of them is in relation to classification of country for aid receipt. Do they have to receive development finals according to the structural characteristic of the countries or according to their income? Another thing we could wonder about is regarding the permanent doubt about the capacity of low-income countries to absorb large inflow of external assistance. But should we not think that absorptive capacity depends on the very modality of aid? On the other hand, we have to consider the problems of very modality of aid and the real appropriation of the proliferation of funds. Are the area or the country where these funds are displayed really priority? And the fourth point had to do with what is new and what is not. When is finance innovative? There is a certain misconception that the agenda for development portrays new ways of financing for development. However, it isn't new. If philanthropic SARs are sometimes classified as innovative, this is essentially due to the greater volume and diversity. The principle itself is not innovative. More clear considered, innovative are the new levy taxes or parafiscal bases that had been introduced or that had been proposed. Finally, I would like to make a few proposals for thinking together about the subject of inequality and the role of the South-South cooperation in relation with finance development on SDG. First, we need to enhance the debate and visibility of the effects of the international crisis on inequality. Each international crisis has an impact on growth and increases inequality. This affects the lower sector worse than the rest of the population. While the richer sector can reconstitute themselves after these shocks, the lower sector always fall back to a weaker starting point. Secondly, it's imperative to limit external indebtedness, which curtail the margins of autonomy of country, and to mobilize internal resources. This was a lesson that came at high social cost in Latin America in the 2000s. And now Argentina has again the endless problem of external indebtedness. We are the country in the world that has contracted more external debt in the last year, and it is not for investment, but for current expenses. In third place, financing of integration is crucial. Regional integration is a powerful factor in reducing vulnerability. So far, it does not appear that external financial has been sufficiently affected to this end. Fourthly, it's crucial to rescind the logic of the right and SDGs from the gaps. For instance, investment, productivity and innovation gap, income gap, inequality, and social security. For the end, and in fifth place, what development model we are considering for the region to reduce inequality. This is persistent debate in Latin America and Argentina. It seems that by just selling commodities all over the world, we have not succeeded in reducing inequalities. Should we not try to take part of digital and services revolution to overcome the age-old dilemma between farming and industry? In this framework, we have to rethink the functional distribution of income and the role of social security, because these are relevant tools of distributions. In the last year, it was possible to reduce inequality in Latin America was for these important tools, although, of course, it was not enough. After all, inequality reduction depends on political decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roxana, for sharing your insightful remarks on reducing inequalities and what role can cooperation and finance can play, and especially in Latin America, we know this is a region which started with very high inequalities, but some of the countries have managed to bring it down, especially Brazil has brought it down with the emphasis on social protection. So I think Asia has much to learn from Latin American countries, because in Asia you see most sharpest rise in inequalities all in major countries, including in India, in China, in Indonesia, wherever you see. So with that, we have listened to all our panelists. We have actually run out of the time for this session, but we started 10 minutes late. So maybe we can spend a few minutes for some burning questions. Yes, I see General Chopra, then this hand. There are 4 hands. So we'll just stick to these 4. General Chopra, please. Can somebody bring mic? Yes. Very short, crisp questions, and you can direct them to any one of the panelists.
It's a very super idea. I'll repeat that. Thank you, Chairman Nagesh. This is to you. It's a very super idea, this business of transactional tax. $700 billion is what I heard. How much do you think this is going to be acceptable? Because taxation, even locally, say India, Pakistan, any country, is very unpopular. Number 2, to me it looks like too much. Number 3, I feel nations might take it as an infringement into their sovereignty. And finally, how do you propose to make this tax mandatory? Thank you, Chairman.
I'll respond to that. Let us take the other questions. Yes. Who are the other? Yes.
I had a very specific question for Mr. Yuri. You were suggesting that there is a range of methods in which development finances have been mobilized in the last 10 to 15 years across countries. And it's also about how the ODA seems to be getting reinterpreted from the other countries. But the fundamental point which we are still struggling is that finances are extremely scattered, and they don't seem to be seeing any continuity across government finances, private sector finances, alternate tax systems that have been created. As a result of which, there is a difference between the visioning of SDGs versus the provisioning. Can we look at some mechanism whereby there is a mechanism of streamlining the entire finance mechanism to have a better continuity across strategies? That's point number one. Secondly, as we keep working with the number of state level and district level functionaries, we find that SDGs seems to have got accepted at the top as an agenda setting, but at the subnational level, very little ownership seems to be taking place. How do we look into such categories? Thank you.
And there were two on this table. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, this is about the financing gap. I think we are looking in terms of the traditional way of program and project design and implementation. And we are missing out a very important resource which we all have in plenty. And that is the human resource. So if we go in for a high degree of social mobilization, community mobilization in most of our projects and programs related to SDGs, we can really bring down the finance cost per se quite a lot. And it has many other advantages. Project becomes more robust, community ownership, and also it's much more efficient. And I think the SDGs provide us with a good opportunity to really mobilize the community. Example, we have the NREGA program in India, where there's a lot of labor in the villages which really are not clear about what they should do. We have had community mobilization campaigns in Cuba for education. We had the Teach India initiative by a prominent newspaper in India. I think we need to tap this resource.
Yes. Okay. Well, before that, Jyoti, and then.
I just wanted you to comment on one aspect. You talked about how Brazil has brought down its inequalities. But when we do basic macroeconomic goals which conflict with each other, it is also marred with a lot of unemployment which is there, which is rising. So how do you trade off between the two?
And the last point, yes.
I guess it's for Yuri and Roxana. Thank you for your presentations. I have a question about this relationship between the multiplex road and the relationship between finance for development and the SDGs. Because this is, I think, maybe a case of how dangerous is this multiplex road. I think there is when I see your presentations, I think there's this huge disconnect between financing for development and the Agenda 2030. We have the Agenda 2030, as Roxana said, with the best of intentions, the best of the goals, and so on and so forth. And we have at the same time all the debate around financing for development, which does not take place exactly in New York, does not take place exactly within the UN system, although we have the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. But it takes place actually at the G20. As Roxana said before, G20 actually drives the entire agenda. And as far as I know, as far as I'm following this debate, all the rhetoric that we have to pass from billions to trillions is a way to de-risk investments in middle-income countries through the flexibilization of the regulation that is already in place, which is something that we can follow in the entire Latin American region. And the results are exactly, for Brazil, is old news. We are getting back in the hunger map, we are getting back in the same old inequality rates and so on and so forth. So how to connect these two let's say, movie theaters or these two rooms, because they are apart, and we are going to lose the implementation of the 23rd agenda.
Thank you. Friends, we have heard some very interesting comments and questions from the floor. So let me begin by asking some of the panelists to respond. I will also respond to the points which were made to me. So Yuri, you have the floor. And very quickly, please.
Thank you.
We have to close.
Okay, you asked the question about fragmented finance. And look, you know, in the UN, we simply say, we are what you want us to be, because the UN is ruled by member states. You want us fragmented, you get it. There is, however, on a positive note, a movement to link at least some of the financial instruments that is happening right now. Certainly in the climate change agenda, there are ongoing early discussions between vertical funds like GEF and the Green Climate Fund and the newly formed LDNF fund, the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, to see if countries can actually present layer cake proposals that link the instruments together. But generally, I think we've reached a point of excessive fragmentation, and so streamlining is on the agenda, but now that these funds are formed, they have their own mechanisms, they have their own governance, and I think it is for member states to develop consistent positions about what do they want. I mean, for instance, India cannot be requesting streamlining, but then voting to create an additional instrument. That would be a contradiction in terms, right? So I think the question is very right. The other question was on central and local SDG implementation. Look, yes, I think there is a dichotomy, but I think it's a factor of lagging rather than contradiction. It is a complex agenda once you get down to the basics of it in the sense of measurement, data and statistics and indicators and targets. But I have to say that, for instance, in India, it's almost there. I think we're kind of 6 to 8 months from finalizing at least the structure of the system and what data is required to be measured and analyzed, all the way from the panchayats, which for you non-Indians are the local governance level, and then into districts and into states, and then how it rolls up to the central level. So I think, honestly, it's a matter of time. Also, I'm cautioning everybody to take the SDGs as kind of the new religion. It's not. Let's not make it what it shouldn't be. It's a framework for thinking, analysis, measurement, and targeting. And balancing between the various things. What's most important about it is not the 17 goals. It's the linkages between the 17 goals, which should promote a whole government approach to resolving certain problems. So, and last but not least, the should this issue be run and debated? You said G20. Actually, it's cooked in the OECD, all right? And it's discussed in the G20. But should it be discussed there or in the UN? I think it's a matter for member states to agree on. I personally think that it should be discussed in the UN fora as a more representative one. India has been consistent, and those of you who do not know, it is the only country in the world that has actually contributed twice in a row to the Office of Taxation within the UN to actually make it viable. Now, what I, quote unquote, blame my Indian friends for is not doing enough lobbying among South-South cooperation and Southern countries, and you know, taking more leadership within the G77 to actually make that lobby a voice that should be counted with, as opposed to just a voice of someone lost in the desert. So, you know, I think it's a process that will continue.
Thank you, Yuri. Sanusha, you wanted to make a comment?
It's a very brief comment on the mandatory tax. And I think the question is really on tax bases and how big these tax bases are across countries. I mean, South Africa has a really small tax base, but an overburdened one to cover a massive social grant system. So I think that has to be something that takes into consideration.
Finally, I want to respond to General Chopra's point about financial transaction tax. The one I was referring to is international financial transaction tax on the short-term money which goes into your country and goes out at a flip of the second, is speculative money, and that is creating a lot of instability. You see the stock exchange movements day to day. It's very largely driven by FII investments, and this is a short-term money. And so this was a proposal discussed some years ago at the height of the financial crisis, that some international transaction tax levied at the clearing house. So its money is transferred through banking channels and digital electronic transfers. So it is very easy to collect it at some some point where the clearance is done. Say BIS, the Bureau of International Settlements, could be the agency to collect it and then give it to the countries. But you need an international agreement for that. And in G20, it was blocked by one country. I won't name it. It is anybody's guess. And so I think if some countries are not ready for it, developing countries which are actually affected by these fluctuating flows, the volatility, they could agree to it at least between themselves, and it will give you a good running stream of revenue. So I think we have to come to an end of this very interesting discussion. And since we have run out of time, I won't try to summarize the discussion, but I'm sure everyone agrees with me that many very interesting ideas were put on the table for cooperation among developing countries, which can generate billions and billions of dollars of new resources, sharing experiences and in innovations in finance, which will be very critical for achieving the Agenda 2030's goals. And on that note, I would like to invite you to give a round of applause to all our eminent speakers. And with that, we bring this to a close, and I think tea is served outside. Thank you.
Pleasure.